With me now to discuss all of this is Thane Rosenbaum. He's a Middle East analyst. Elie Jacobs, a partner at Truman National Security Project. And Eric Mandel, the director of the Middle East Information Network. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Matthew Brodsky, a senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with me tonight.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thane, let's start with you. What do you make of this news that reportedly the White House is not inviting any Israeli government officials?
I've always thought it was the right move. I think that this should be focused entirely on the possibility of Palestinian prosperity, and it shouldn't get muddied up by thinking that Israel should participate. This is really for the Palestinians. This summit, this workshop is intended to show a pathway for a future economic prosperity for the Palestinian people, whether it's in a state or some other arrangement for the Palestinians, but it's there to provide a future which they have not seen since before the 1967 war.
Elie, do you agree that it's the right move to not have any officials from the Israeli government there?
I'm not sure. I agree with the professor that the big question is what exactly is the funding going towards? Is this a one state? Is this a two state? Are the Palestinians going to have a free-flowing economy? Are they going to have their own currency? Are they going to be subsumed by Jordan and Egypt? The big question is what exactly is this thing being funded towards? It's basically, no different than funding for a venture capital fund that no one knows what the end result is. So without an idea of what the end goal is, I'm really troubled by the idea that money is just being put in towards something.
Why do we need an end goal at this stage, Eric Mandel, considering so far starting with the political aspect hasn't yielded any results? So why not try a different approach and start off with the economic aspect?
Well, I think Bibi Netanyahu had always said that he wants a approach from the bottom up because the Palestinian Authority has been intransient, and when they've been offered everything they supposedly want, they said no. And so I don't think this is a bad idea, realizing that this is a first step. I think just going back to your original question, I think the reason why Israeli government is not there is because I think no Palestinian businessmen would have come, and they really needed to do this, or else they would have had their lives in danger when they went back.
And again, we're waiting that interview with Jason Greenblatt. We're looking right now at live pictures of Rabbi Shmuley Boteach at the World Value Network making his introduction. Before we get into that interview between Jason Greenblatt and Bret Stephens, a New York Times columnist and former editor of the Jerusalem Post, and we're of course expecting them to touch on a number of issues, including the very critical issue of attendance and what can be achieved at this economic conference without any Palestinian leadership and without any Palestinian business leaders. Let's dissect some of the pertinent information we've gleaned from this so far. And joining me to do that is Thane Rosenbaum, Elie Jacobs, Eric Mandel, and Matt Brodsky. Thane, let's start with you. What was your main takeaway from this so far?
I think it's interesting that unlike the president who speaks the language of the ultimate deal, we're hearing Greenblatt and Kushner also speaking about much more measured expectations, that in fact they might fail, that they may not actually conclude a deal because the Palestinians will simply reject it like they always have in the past, but that this is worth still presenting, putting forward to the world the opportunity for Palestinian prosperity, for them to have a future. If they could get rid of their leadership, they might actually be back enticed to the table and say, the Trump administration was offering us something, and maybe it was something that might have led to statehood, but in the meantime, we didn't get a chance to be there at all. So I think that's what's interesting, is that his audience is beyond the Palestinian leadership. He's reaching to the Palestinian people, he's speaking to the Gulf states, he's speaking to Egypt and Jordan and the rest of the world, and he's literally avoiding the Palestinian leaders.
That did seem to be a big point that Greenblatt was making, Eric Mandel, that it's about improving the lives of the Palestinian people, and that they should be blaming their leaders for the economic conditions that they have, and then for the economic conditions that they will continue to have if their Palestinian leadership doesn't do more to step up and help them. What was your main highlight from what we heard tonight?
In listening where they're separating the economics and the political, and I understand that, I think somebody has to articulate when people talked about, is this going to be a demilitarized state or all these other things? The biggest fear from the Israelis is this becomes a failed state. This becomes Hamastan. And if you build up, the people build this up and they need to create the foundations of a state. They did not do what the Israelis did 100, 120 years ago. And they don't realize that, at least maybe the people don't realize, that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. They actually do know it by the polls of what they say, and they need to start getting in the institutions of a real democracy, of a democracy not just in an election, even though this is obviously, there hasn't been an election in 15 years. They have to develop freedom of speech, freedom of the press. They have to be able to not have misogyny. They need to be able to become a modern state. Something like, even though it may not happen, Vision 2030 of Mohammed bin Salman. They need to have a vision themselves to sell it, or else they will simply become Hamastan if Israel's security disappears.
Elie, the big reason has always been why start with the economic aspect of it? Why not focus on the political? That's been one of the gripes, at least from the Palestinian leadership. Jason Greenblatt attempted to answer that. Let's take a listen.
The reason we're starting with the economics first is twofold. One, this is a very detailed peace vision. You cannot have a successful peace agreement without a successful economic plan, which means we're worried about the day after, the weeks after, the months after, and the years after. We don't want to set up a political plan only to find out that it fails, and we would put the region into a worse position than the position that it is in now.
Elie, what do you make of that approach? Do you agree that considering other things have failed in the past, why not try a different approach?
Right. I mean, the idea of trying a novel approach is attractive to anybody who's been paying attention to this for the last 30, 40, 50, 150 years, as Eric was mentioning. But the reality is that you have 3 real estate attorneys and Donald Trump who are trying to pretend that this is an economic and a real estate deal, when the reality on the ground, to both what Eric and Thane were saying, is that this has much more to do than just economics and real estate. That there's the reality of what the Palestinian people want, and there's the reality of what the Israelis are willing to take. Netanyahu has been very outspoken in saying that in any peace accord, Israel must control the Jordan Valley and that must be a demilitarized state. If those two things aren't happening, Netanyahu may walk away from this as something that's a joke as well.
But that's phase 2. And Mike Brodsky, phase 1, at least as we understand it, is about economic development, making the lives of the Palestinian people better in the interim, at least as a starting step, get them to have improved living conditions. When we say economic development, though, what exactly does that mean?
I think we're going to find out. It's going to be investment, but part of the investment and part of the reason for having the conference is because the administration is very interested in not repeating a mistake that was made in previous peace attempts when the rest of the Arab leaders in the region wasn't lined up behind the process. So this is one way to tie them into it. Now, of course, there are issues of good governance and issues of institution building, all of which are necessary. And those, I'm told, are also going to be on the table and discussed during this summit or during this workshop. It's quite tragic that the Palestinian Authority is boycotting and having a campaign to try to get other countries not to attend. It's another opportunity missed in a long list. But I think having the workshop first before releasing the political plan was going to happen either way. Of course, now there's a bigger pause for the Israeli elections, but once you release the political plan, that becomes the only game in town, and they want to make sure that they have a very good strong case that they're presenting to the Palestinian people, since what they're hearing from the Palestinian leadership is essentially just a pile of lies. They're misrepresentations.
Eric, do you think that is going to resonate? Because that does seem to be at least one of the positives that can come out of this. If nothing else, perhaps the Palestinian people are going to understand that their leadership is failing them. And that's another point that Greenblatt was stressing. Let's take a listen.
It would have been great if the Palestinian leadership showed up to give feedback. Instead, they not only chose to boycott it, they chose to try to undermine it by telling everybody else not to attend or to lower the level of attendance at the event. How does that help the Palestinian people? That's terrible for the Palestinian people. We're not exactly trying to circumvent it. I would use a different way to describe it. I would say we want the people to understand what awaits them.
Eric, do you think that could be a realistic goal of this? Perhaps not the deal of the century, perhaps no deal at all, but perhaps create an understanding, a further understanding amongst the Palestinian people that the United States, Israel, and the majority of the region want them to have better lives, but it's their leadership that's standing in the way?
I think there's some truth to this. I think the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to have the light of day here, is because the Palestinian people, if they see what's given here, they will see a light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe economics are something, and of course anybody cares about their children, that this can motivate them. On the other hand, there's been generations of incitement that have told the Palestinian people that your neighbors who are prospering on your land. Mm-hmm. And so could economics entice them enough to see if there's some compromise? Again, the Palestinian Authority may be the best friend Israel has, because what will replace it can be something even worse if they have a fair and free election.
Elie, for all of the poo-pooing, if you will, about this conference and the odds that it's not going to be a success, is it at least significant that you have a conference being held in Bahrain with the likes of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco attending, and even though the Palestinian people are urging them to boycott it out of resentment towards the Israelis and the Americans, is that at least a significant development and signs of how the region may be changing?
There's something significant about it. I'll disagree with something our colleague in D.C. said in terms of the Arabs never pushing the Palestinians towards anything. The Saudi king was outspoken in pushing Arafat during the Camp David conversations during the Clinton administration to push Arafat to actually take the deal. So in terms of getting all those people around the table, that's fantastic. But I think that you actually have to take the step back and look at the regional politics as a whole and recognize that that group of people are also all basically allied against Iran. Mm-hmm. So being in Donald Trump's favor by showing up to this thing creates a bulwark against Iran, which is much more important to this group of Arab states than the Palestinian issue.
Matt, what do you make of the increasing tensions with Iran? We learned earlier that the United States is preparing to send 1,000 troops to the region. Iran is threatening to now enrich its uranium to levels that breach the 2015 nuclear deal in 10 days' time. All this happening with this Bahrain conference just over a week away now. What impact are these tensions going to have on this?
Well, I don't think that there's going to be much in the way of an effect on the Bahrain conference. I think that is obviously something that both the United States and Israel will be keeping a close eye on. And the United States, under Bolton and Pompeo, both have made very clear statements that they will stand by their allies and will hold Iran and its proxies responsible for whatever takes place there. I think something that we shouldn't lose in what we just heard, though, in the conference there with Jason Greenblatt, is that the extent to which Jason agreed with what Brett Stevens was saying when it came to what would constitute a good state. Now, I actually take heart in that, because it means that what they're doing right now in the meantime is in fact breaking up a lot of Palestinian Authority mythology, which happens to be a prerequisite toward making any form of progress. If that is all that happens throughout the entire process, is that the embassy was moved to Jerusalem, that the Land for Peace formula was not considered 100% all the time anymore, and that other mythologies begin to crumble, we can then get toward a more realistic settlement. I think that's very important, that this administration seems to understand that, and I take heart in that.
And Elie, do you think that that's a fair point? Do you think that that's a realistic, potentially good outcome of this?
It's a phenomenal point. And if the end goal is, and Thane and we were talking about it earlier, if the end goal is to create a new so-called pocket agreement where the starting line is something different going forward, that would be a success in my book. I think, as Thane was saying, that the idea of the great deal is not something that even Jared or Jason agree with, but the idea of potentially moving the goalposts and breaking that Palestinian mythology, that would be a win in my book.
Eric?
I absolutely agree. Again, I think this could be a foundational document that can be a beginning that even a future administration can have. Once it's there, I think it can have a momentum of its own, but I do think the underlying message here is still about Iran. And I think one of the things that we really need to come out of this is to make sure that people realize that Palestinians are a tertiary issue in the Middle East from American national security interests. The main part is Iran from American security interests besides Israel, and certainly for the Gulf states. And if we could have that as a focus and realize that if, God forbid, there wasn't in Israel, the Iran situation will be there, the Syrian genocide would still be there, Egypt would still be a basket case, Jordan will still be fragile, Al-Qaeda will be there, all of these things. And so I think if you can make this issue small, maybe the expectation small, we can get to, as an American who speaks to Congress, that this will enhance our interests by putting it as a tertiary issue.
And Thane, of course, you can't dismiss the fact that Iran is the major backer of Hamas, which is the biggest obstacle, arguably, to peace between Israel and the Palestinians, considering their failure to recognize Israel's right to exist.
I was just going to say, Michelle, that one thing, we're not making the distinction again between Gazans and West Bank Palestinians. Mm-hmm. They're very different people. They're actually the same people, and yet they're not the same people. The Gazans, I think that when Greenblatt is talking about the incentives for Palestinians, he's bypassing the Gazans. He's not even thinking about them, because they tend to be much more rejectionist. They tend to be, look, the March of Return is all about the return of Israel for them. They're not interested in living beside any Jewish state.
And that was a point that Greenblatt was stressing, and why there needs to be caution with the term two-state solution, because can there be a two-state solution when you have the likes of Fatah and Hamas at odds? All right, we have been discussing the Bahrain Economic Workshop. Thanks very much to my panel